welcome to the first of two conversations that we are calling Gig Worker Voice. These will be conversations among gig workers across multiple sectors of the economy about the work ahead for the gig worker movement. I am Michelle Miller. I am the co-founder and co-director of Coworker, and we are proud to have partnered with Gig Workers Collective to help pull these conversations together. Today, our discussion will center on the question of what they don't tell you about being a gig worker. And we have a group of freelance and gig economy workers from across multiple sectors of the economy here today. I am here with Vanessa Bain from the Gig Workers Collective, Alana Evans from the Adult Entertainment Artists Guild, Kim Kelly, a freelance journalist, Jean Cook from the Music Workers Alliance, and Esterphanie St Just from Rideshare Drivers United. This is going to be a conversation about what makes everyone on this panel gig workers, what we share in common, what are our differences. And I think this is a really timely conversation because there's been a lot of competition over the past few years to define what gig work is, what gig workers want, what he or she may think about in the future for what should define them. There are a lot of people, from policymakers to companies to lobbyists to advocates, who have had a say in the ways in which we are defining what this work is. And our intent in pulling this conversation together was to center that conversation in workers themselves, and to have a group effort to try and start to define what this economy looks like, and what we want and deserve. So before we begin, I want to give everyone an opportunity to introduce themselves. Everybody, please share your name, where you're from, and what they don't tell you about being the gig worker that you are. What are the misconceptions about your work and the unique challenges that you face? And I'm going to hand it off to our co-convener, Vanessa Bain, to start.
Hey, everybody. Vanessa Bain. I am an Instacart shopper of over 5 years, and co-founder of an organization called Gig Workers Collective. I think the most surprising thing for me when I started doing this work was how vastly different the experience was from how it's marketed to workers, right? It's flexibility, it's independence, it's all of these very nice sounding things. And it turns out that my boss is just an algorithm instead of a human being. And so we're managed in very similar ways to traditional workers, with even less support than I would say exists in a traditional workplace for workers. And I should pass it along to somebody else now, right, Michelle? All right, I will pass it along to Kim Kelly.
Thank you. My name is Kim Kelly. I live in Philly. And I've been a freelance journalist for a very long time, but the one thing that still throws me off after all these years is that no matter how established or successful or known you might be, people still want you to work for free. They still want you to work for exposure. They still want to offer you opportunities without a paycheck attached. And they still take their sweet time paying you once you actually do that work. And I'm going to pass it to Alana.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Alana Evans. I am an adult film actress, platform performer, and creator since 1998. I'm also the president of the first union in my industry called the Adult Performers Actors Guild, which later became the Adult Performance Artists Guild. And I think the one thing that no one really talks about when you come into my industry is really how much of a job it is. I think a lot of people automatically assume that, we're just, performers in that way, but it involves so much business, it involves so much marketing and all of these skills that you really need to have in order to move yourself forward in this industry. And also learning all the things that we have in common with all of the other gig workers. So thank you for having me. And I'm going to pass it over to Jean Cook.
Thank you. My name is Jean Cook. I'm a musician and one of the founders of Music Workers Alliance. And something that people in our industry don't talk a lot about, I have to agree with a lot of Kim's things as well. People often do ask musicians to work for free. But the thing that I feel like is really striking as well is that you need a lot access to capital to be able to get started. And there's actually quite a bit of capital that you need before, if you're going to be in a band, if you're going to be making a record, or even just working as a freelancer and switching health insurance. And all of a sudden you realize you're going to need a reserves to take care of your cash flow issues because your bills are going to be unpredictable and when are they coming in? I think the access to capital thing is a big one. And then the other thing that I would also say is that in my area of music, not everybody is like this, but I often work in groups. So I work in bands or I work for other people who are also working with groups. We work creatively together, and that the people who are paying me are often just as precarious, if not more precarious than I am. I'll pass it to Esterphanie.
Hello, my name is Esterphanie. I'm a founding member of Rideshare Drivers United. I've been organizing actually since 2000, actually 3 months after I started Rideshare, before I started working for Uber and Lyft. I was in my first protest in 2015. So what I want to say is that gig workers, I understand we borrowed that expression. It was borrowed for us rather from, like musicians, the traditional gig worker. I say we're not gig workers, we're app-based workers. And that you can take more seriously. Because gig workers, if we continue saying it, it is important what you say. So if you're a gig worker, you're not so serious. You're just doing it for extra money, fly by. It's just like, oh, as long as you make a couple dollars, what does it matter? But we're app-based workers. And the industry, we saw that in Prop 22, where Uber made friends with their mortal enemy, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, because they're the same business. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you're doing, and they apply the same rules. Now, what happened was that somewhere in the 80s or probably 70s, it even started, that the American economy changed, where the focus was no longer manufacturing. I remember I was 15 when Ronald Reagan did his State of the Union address. And he said that we were going to become a service economy. Service, I was a teenager. I remember I was kneeling in front of the TV and I said, so we're going to become a servant economy? How's that a good thing? So what it is now, and we've seen the result of that. The wealthy it's smaller and smaller. It used to be the top 10%. Now it's the top 5%. Now the top 1%. And well, the service economy, that is the main economy where most Americans, they do some kind of service work overall because we're no longer a manufacturing society. Well, how do corporations make profit? Because their job, they only have one job, to make profit. Well, they found it, the gig economy. Because the longer you work, the less you make. When I started, I was making $1.20 per mile. Right now, today, if I'm a driver out of LAX, I can get paid 32 cents per mile.
Thank you, Esterphanie.
Do I point somebody else?
No, you closed that out, and you closed it out beautifully. Thank you so much. And I just really want to pick up on what you said at the beginning about borrowing the expression gig workers, because I think so much of what we are trying to do in these spaces as we're going forward is figure out together, like, what is the language gig workers, or I'm sorry, app-based drivers and other people working in the informal economy want to actually have to adequately describe the work that is going on and the way that it's structured. So I'm going to give everyone a little bit more time to talk about each of your roles in the economy. And I'm going to start with Alana. Alana, can you talk to us a little bit more about the vulnerabilities you face in the adult industry and in your role as a gig worker and in your organizing?
Absolutely. Thank you. You know, inherently, a lot of people that come into the adult industry in the first place are people younger in age. Historically, we would average most workers being 18 to 25 years old, majority women. Often we would see women of color. But I think the biggest aspect was young moms and myself. That is what brought me into the adult industry, was a way to be able to care for my family, that gave me the free time from, managing my work hours or my schedule and still being able to be there for my kids. And I know a lot of other gig workers, and definitely now, as we absolutely are, or Stephanie is totally correct, even in my industry, we are app-based workers now. And so many people come into the different facets of app-based work because of the flexibility. And I remember, when Prop 5 was coming up, and the language behind it affected some parts of my industry specifically, and other sides of the industry it didn't. But what it created was a conflict. And you have people working together doing the same job with different opinions or different reasons why they're there. The platforms or apps are benefiting because we're fighting against each other in order to find a space through that's going to be beneficial for everyone. And then, of course, when Prop 22 came through, many of us saw relief, thankfully. But we still see these issues where, from my industry, majority of our workers, depending on the app that you're working on, you don't see all of your tips. You can work for one particular company and maybe see 35% of your money that you've earned as far as tips, as far as streaming income. And when you express that to someone else, they're usually completely shocked. But because we're this taboo industry to many people, it's harder for us to get that conversation out there. It's harder for us to be able to have people take it seriously when I express to them, for my on-set porn performers, which I was for nearly 20 years, there's no workers' comp. There's no protection if something happens on set. The costs that performers have to pay before they can even begin working that involve testing or preparation, because unlike Uber or Lyft, where what you need is a vehicle, we need our presence, what we look like, whether we're prepared with wardrobe and things like that. And so there's always this inherent involvement and cost that you have to put forward even to get started in that type of work. So where my workers can really be vulnerable in that respect is they don't always understand the effort, the involvement that it's going to require to be successful, how exhausting mentally and physically the work can be. It can be incredibly rewarding. It's not always the same experience for everyone, but in my position, and just like every other organizer here, we're always working to make sure that we can, get in front of the dangerous parts, be able to protect them, guide them, give them the education that they need to help protect themselves moving forward. And so there's so many different things that people, even myself, moving in, you don't realize until these things happen. And so, the app-based work completely changed everything. If you have an issue, and say that they claim that you violated their terms of service, the same way you can if you're an Uber driver or a Lyft driver or DoorDash, they will freeze our accounts and take all of our money. And if it's not for people like me that have lawyers on standby that give their time for free to help us, we end up being victims of the apps themselves. So it's a lot of things to be prepared for and pay attention to.
May I say something in support of what you're saying? It's the magic in being an independent contractor is that you yourself, if you have a problem, if you face discrimination or any kind of unfairness, you have to take them to court yourself. I can't get together with you or with another worker, because traditionally, I worked as a real estate agent, which is a true independent contractor, where I signed no contract where I didn't have something to do with the contract, where my needs or desires are written in the contract. So traditionally, you hammer out all the details with the employer before you sign the contract. And then when you both agree, it's to your satisfaction both, then you sign it and then you do the job. It's not that we send you the contract and tell you either sign this contract as is, or you no longer have access to the platform. That means me and my Prius have got to have the money to fight a major corporation with billion-dollar funds in the Prius. So that means we, in effect, can't do anything. We are indentured servants. They have all the power. The employer has all the power. They're dictating what we can and cannot do. And all we can say is yes or no. And they say that, well, we can pick our own hours. I got news for you. There's no law that says that you have to work X amount of hours. So a regular employer could do it as well. I think we have to own our name, app-based workers, so that we are taken seriously. Because gig workers, it's a gig. What does it matter?
Thank you so much, Esterphanie. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions for the panelists, from these amazing comments, please drop them in the Q&A in the chat. We'll be taking them at the end. I wanted to invite Jean to come in next, because so much of what Alana described felt like it reflected some of your comments earlier about capital and sort of taking on so much of the financial risk of going into this work, and just to talk about like what's been hard about being in the industry, and how important has finding community been for you.
Thank you. I definitely resonated with all of the different things you have to do before you can even get ready, right? So musicians are buying their own instruments, they're renting rehearsal space, they're finding time for childcare so they can write their songs, so they can go and make their record. They have to pay for the record now. That didn't used to be the case before music went digital. So you could get record labels to pay for your records, but that isn't the case anymore now. Over the last year, with the pandemic and the shutdown of live music, it's been a wake-up call for a lot of musicians who realize that they do have recorded music. It is out there, and there is money that they're earning from the uses of the music, but that was an area of their own business that they may not have paid much attention to in the past. And there's good reasons for people not paying attention to how your royalties and all the copyright stuff works. A good metaphor for it would be to look at something like the healthcare system, where it is like, if you're an artist, if you're a musician, you have all of these different entities, like you've got Spotify, you've got ASCAP BMI, you've got Sound Exchange that are supposed to collect a different part of your copyright royalties, and they're supposed to send them to you. But A, you have to know about them. And then B, you have to know how to interact with them so you'll be successful in receiving what you're supposed to get. For the most part, a lot of these folks, they're kind of siloed. They don't talk to each other. And when I say that it's like the healthcare industry, it feels very much like when you have to go to the doctor and they're like, oh, well, here's a prescription for something. You go to the pharmacy and they're like, oh, well, this isn't quite the right prescription. You have to call your doctor. And then the doctor's like, oh, actually, you know what I need to do? I need to call a specialist for you. But it isn't that they call the specialist, you have to call the specialist. The healthcare industry has all of these different silos that are centering the patient theoretically, but are actually dependent on the free labor of the patient to make all the pieces work. In the music industry, that feels like a very familiar concept, in the sense that you have labels, you have publishers, you have the people who use the music, and then you have the live industry. And there are pieces of it that really should be working together, but they're not. And it's really up to the musician to figure out how each of these different systems and different platforms work. And that's labor that is uncompensated. So when I think about what's hard about being in the industry is that there's so many different business models for musicians. You can put your income together in so many different ways. And so there isn't a single playbook for how do you go out there and make sure you get all of the money that you're supposed to be getting. And so it's a question of kind of what's the return on investment. And that's where coming together with others becomes incredibly important. You learn from other people's hopefully you're not making too many mistakes and learning from the mistakes. You're able to learn from what other people have learned in the industry. And so there are a lot of places where folks will come together and they'll share information about, well, this is actually how CD distribution works. Oh, Bandcamp's really good. By the way, Bandcamp's really good. It's better than Spotify. If you're looking for music, that's a good place to start. But then also during the pandemic, we saw more and more interest in folks coming together and saying, well, this is how unemployment works. How did it work for you? And in our case, where a lot of musicians are a mix of 1099 and W-2 workers, explaining like, okay, well, the system isn't really meant for people like us. This is what I have found that has worked, or this is how you can make sure, like right now they have that mixed earner income, mixed earner benefit that's been passed as a result. Like the pandemic has stress tested a lot of these systems and shown how they don't work for people who have mixed incomes or for people who get income from multiple states because they're touring. Like, how do you even do that? So the community's been really important to share that kind of information, and also just to kind of reduce the general risk and fatigue and the free labor that's kind of required to continue to survive in this space.
Thank you, Jean. That was really helpful. And your comments on community made me think of all of the work that Vanessa's done, and specifically the way that your community has been impacted and organized around the pandemic. And I just wanted you to share maybe with everyone how the pandemic has affected, gig workers collective members and people working in the gig industry, whether you feel safe and what kind of protections you actually need to feel safe and secure and healthy at work.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think first I should start off by saying that, like, gig work has always been dangerous work. And by gig work in this context, I'm talking about app-based algorithmically managed work, such as being an Uber driver, being an Instacart shopper. Even prior to the pandemic, we had occupational risks of injury and fatality that were like 2 to 4 times higher than first responders. So our jobs are very dangerous. And this has been a classic game in the sort of like labor world of like, how do we misclassify people to pass off all the costs, risks, and liabilities of very dangerous work onto individuals like myself or Esterphanie or any of the other folks that are on this panel. And the answer for gig companies was to simply call us an independent contractor and continue to manage us and boss us in every bit the same way that a traditional boss would. The only difference is that my boss is right here with me all the time. And I can't turn it off if I want to, unfortunately. But, you know, the pandemic was, I think that Jean said, you know, it was like a stress test of all of these existing systems. And that was so true for us in that, you know, rideshare, for example, completely decimated, right? Like the demand for it was much lower. The ability to continue to make ends meet as a rideshare driver became nearly impossible. Whereas for Instacart, because everybody is sheltering in place and now they're really contracting out those risks onto folks like myself, our industry was really like booming, right? Like Instacart saw record profit and record growth during the onset of the pandemic and really benefited from it, right? So they weren't in a situation where it was like, how do we afford to keep all of these people employed like some of the smaller traditional employers were. They failed to protect us in any meaningful kind of way. No PPE, no disinfectants, no precautions in terms of like taking your temperature and making sure that you're healthy when you go to work. It was just go to work. So Gig Workers Collective actually organized a strike of Instacart workers last March to demand PPE. And like, it took a ton of us making a hell of a lot of noise for them to even think about doing that, right? You know, companies have leverage in terms of like being able to commission a manufacturer to make a supply of safety materials for their workers. And categorically, every single one of the you know, like app-based companies failed to do that and failed to provide it until workers got really noisy and walked off our jobs to demand it. So we were able to successfully secure some PPE for Instacart shoppers and Ship shoppers as well, who had to walk off of their jobs like a week later for the exact same thing, which did, though, I will say, start sort of a ripple effect within the app boss world of employers saying, oh shoot, maybe we need to actually be providing these things because we look really bad if we don't, right? And yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately a lot of the pre-existing conditions of being a gig worker, of being algorithmically managed, and having that misclassification, you know, they existed prior to the pandemic, but were really highlighted and really seen maybe under like a magnifying glass because of the conditions pandemic has put us in. For folks that weren't able to work, there became this mad scramble of how do we replace our income? Like, you know, like we're categorized as independent contractors, which means we're not eligible for unemployment, right? And questionably in certain states, as a app boss worker, you are eligible for unemployment. The unemployment system doesn't know how to process those sorts of applications. And so it was a really a mad scramble and very chaotic, especially in the very beginning, trying to figure out just how to keep people fed, how to keep their lights on, how to keep them home safe if they're immunocompromised and can't go to work. So unfortunately, you know, there's this underlying structure that denies us access to things like employer-sponsored health insurance, that denies us access to things like workers' compensation, paid sick leave, and a whole host of things that, you know, we've fought and people have literally died to secure for workers in this country. So unfortunately, you know, we've been governed by labor laws of yesteryear and over 100 years ago, right? We're working in the absence of any meaningful protections for an increasingly large segment of workers in this country and around the world. So I will cut it off here, but it's been a rough year, unfortunately, continuing to assume all of those risks without any of the protections that we need to do that safely.
Kim, I want to bring you in here as a freelance journalist who's also been a staff journalist to talk about the differences there and the ways in which you have connected with other workers without a centralized place of work, because there's been some really incredible organizing in the digital media industry over the past few years that I know you've been really deeply involved in.
Right. So, I mean, first, just to say, as a labor reporter, this has been wonderful just be present for this conversation. But as an independent contractor, as a freelancer, as a worker, it's also really nice to just be among my people, you know, because as much as I love my job and it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do the work I do, it's still a job, not financially secure, not that well paid, pretty stressful, you know, not ideal. No job is. But, you know, I also, yes, I've been a freelancer full time since 2019 when I got laid off, which is a very familiar circumstance to a lot of people that work in digital media, like thousands upon thousands of us in the past few years. And prior to that, you know, I got to work in an office and build connections with people there and kind of have that institutional backing and be part of that kind of media bubble in Brooklyn. And that was a huge leg up that not everyone has access to, you know. Once I got laid off, I was kind of just, you know, set loose. All right, figure it out, kid. But I came into it with that kind of that leg up, you know, that privilege of having the experience. Obviously, the privilege of being a cis white woman in this industry. Most of the positions of power in media in general and in digital media are held by white men. And that makes it so much harder for anyone who doesn't fit into that description to get anywhere. Even doubly so for Black and brown workers, marginalized workers. It's not, it's pretty hard to succeed in this industry, whatever that success even looks like to you. It's hard to get by. And so the fact that I've been part of the labor movement since, I guess, 2015 when we organized back at Vice, that's been a huge help for not just me, but so many other people in the industry, because that we kind of got in on the ground floor. Like there was Gawker, then it was Vice, and then there's this phenomenal domino effect throughout the digital media industry with my union, the Writers Guild of America East, and the News Guild, both just kind of pounced and we're like, we're going to organize this industry. And it's an ongoing battle, but there's been a ton of progress made there. And so now there are thousands upon thousands of people who work in newsrooms and who don't work in newsrooms, who have been through that experience, who understand what it's like to come up with a contract, to bargain, to sit across the table from your boss face to face and be like, look, that's not good enough. And it's an incredibly empowering experience that a lot of us, you know, we really need. You know, this industry does its best to grind you down and make you feel like you're not really worth much of anything, because there are so many demands for free labor, expectations for free labor, the offer of being paid in exposure. You know, even the biggest legacy publications you can think of, the biggest newspapers in the world, they don't pay that well. They don't care that much if you're freelance. You can write something for the Washington Post and get $200. And it's nice to have $200, but that's only like, my rent is a lot more than that, you know, and you got to do that over and over and over. And so being part of the labor movement, being part of my union, being on my guild's council for the past 4 years, I'm going for term 3 in September or August, that's really opened up the way that I see the potential for organizing in our industry, you know, and over the past few years with the growth of projects like the Freelance Solidarity Project, which is affiliated with the National Writers Union, and the IWW's Freelance Journalist Union, these two projects that are actively seeking to organize and advocate for freelance journalists who are traditionally left out of the whole conversations. We're, like so many people here, we're just kind of left to fend for ourselves. We're independent contractors. Not all of us asked to be, but there are only so many jobs to go around, and so many companies, publications have realized there's a lot of us out here and they don't have to afford us the same rights and protections and benefits that they offer to their staffers, who they're probably going to lay off in 10 minutes anyway. Just that the rampant instability and inequality and inequity in this industry, I think the only path forward, the only way for any of us to get out of this thing alive is to continue organizing and to work to have people who are on staff and who aren't on staff to realize that we're in this together. We're eventually going to switch places. It's really just musical chairs when it comes to staff jobs. Like, if you're not like me yet, you're going to be eventually, unless you're like some fancy rich white guy, but I'm not as concerned about you. You're probably fine. So everyone else I'm concerned about. And that's what I focus on in my reporting and focus on in my organizing and focus on in just my day-to-day interactions with other writers, because it's hard to build community when you're so atomized. Like, so many of my best friends in the writing world, like we're all over the place. They're in Europe, they're across the country. And it's really, as much as it's a blessing and a curse, social media, places like Twitter, really do a lot to bring us together. And then I really want to shout out Study Hall. I think I'll shut up after this, but I really want to shout out Study Hall, which is this community that has been built by and for freelancers that provides a lot of resources that you kind of can't get anywhere else. Like, there's things happening. You know, if you're a freelancer right now, you're not alone. And that's something that I'm really glad this panel is really illuminating.
That was fantastic, Kim. Thank you so much. I'm going to close this part out with Esterphanie. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about, what it is really like to be managed by an algorithm. That Vanessa said that at the top, like, I don't get to have a human boss, I get to have an algorithm. And I've really been thinking that I think it's a moral question around whether or not it's okay that anybody is managed by a robot. And so I'm just curious about what your thoughts are about that and what that experience is like day to day.
I'm not a data engineer or any of that stuff, but I think what it is that the employer thinks of how can they make the most amount of money. And to do that, it usually involves a certain amount of control. So they tell their engineers to work out a system. This way, the orders are given in a way that benefits the company. Like, for instance, what you ordinarily find as an Uber driver, as a Lyft driver, like when you first start, you get great rides. They're long, they're far, they have the bonuses, they have all these pluses attached to them. Then after 2 months, it starts to change. You're no longer at the head of line, because they're very much like drug dealers. They're trying to seduce you, trying to, make you think this is possible, make you dependent on them. That this is the way you're going to take care of yourself. And once you get dependent on them, then they wean off. All the things that you liked slowly gets taken away or starts shifting. So then you find out, like, for example, they would give you X amount of dollars after you did 60 rides, right? Or something like that. Then they're like, oh, she made the 60 rides. Okay, we'll give it to you. Next week, it's going to be 70 rides. Can you do it in 70? Then can you do it in 80? Then can you do it 120? And the bonus starts whittling out. Meanwhile, if you have a friend who you signed up, you'll find out that they're making more per trip than you are, because they're in the seduction phase. And all of that gets done through the app.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It sure does. And it's a really, really helpful breakdown, specifically of the way that it's designed to kind of rope you in and then leave you stuck. So I just want to talk a little bit about the themes that came up and see if other panelists wanted to speak to anything anyone else said. One of the things that really moved me was the way Alana started by saying, like, I wanted flexibility to care for my family because I'm a young mom. And that I know that there are other mothers on the panel and who probably are facing these same issues. And it made me think about how the kind of binary conversation around this work has always been you either get flexibility or you get access to the social safety net, essentially. And like, what could we imagine that we could have where our children are taken care of, we are able to work, and we are able to see them when we need to? Like, do we have to be tied to a desk 9 hours a day in exchange for, our freedom, essentially? So I'm just curious about like other panelists, or even Alana, if you want to say more about that, about like where we see the other kind of structural failures that are letting us all down as workers, and making this sort of choice between flexibility and stability a false one.
I'm going to jump in really quickly. As a mom, there was a certain appeal to like, pardon me, sorry. There was a certain appeal to the idea, especially because I had worked in education previously. So it was like, I was like at work when my daughter was going to school and getting out of school and stuff like that. And there was something very magical and like amazing to me about the idea that I could just like take like 15 minutes off at a time and take my kid to school and pick her up from school and be able to like check in and see her. I think the unfortunate reality is that, I think Esterphanie spoke about this really eloquently. The idea that like you start off at the highest rate of pay and the best conditions you're ever going to get in this work. And then it's like a downward, trajectory from there, unfortunately. And with that downward trajectory in terms of our pay and our work conditions comes actually a lot less flexibility and a lot less independence. So whereas, if I was making $25 or $30 on an order previously, I could maybe accept a little bit less work each day, or I could, make the choice to decline an offer because I had something else that I had to do. It really got to a point for me where it was like, I had to accept whatever I possibly could because I had a phone bill that was due, or I had rent that was due, or I had my car payment that I had to make so that I could even keep coming back to work. And so I think that, very similarly to like sharecropping or a company store model, like we end up in this cyclical poverty of our work where we have to make very extreme sacrifices just to be able to keep going to do this work. And one of the questions I think that I'm asked the most is like, why do you keep doing it then? Right. And I think that the assumption that there is a choice of whether or not we stay doing this work or move on to something else is a matter of privilege, right? A lot of us end up owing money on cars, or we go through an entire car before we're done paying it off, and what this is sold to us as is you have a phone, you have a car, you have a job. And the reality is that there's so many other expenses that are built into this work. We have to have things like liability insurance. We're supposed to obtain things like private workers' compensation. We have to pay for our own insurance. We end up in debt to either our employer directly or because of the plummeting earnings that we have and our increased costs or our increased costs. So I'm gonna stop now, but that just really like, it set something off in me where I was like, I did think when I first started doing this work, I'd be able to see my kid more. And that slipped further and further and further away from me the longer that I was doing this work.
And what is this thing that people always tell us, well, why don't you just quit? I mean, do you tell a teacher that? Why don't you just quit? Do you tell a chef that? Why don't you just quit? You don't even tell someone who works at McDonald's that. Why don't you just quit? So that means it's our fault. We're not taken seriously, since the answer is just quitting and you can get another job.
Yeah.
So that means nothing can be done.
I think that speaks to how our work is perceived by people and how intentional that framing has been by our bosses and by capitalists in general, that our work is not real work. And it goes for every single person on this panel. Every person on this panel has heard, oh, you're a freelancer, that's not real work. Or, oh, you're an Uber driver, that's not real work. You're an adult performer, that's not real work. You're a musician, that's not real work. And it's like we're in this constant position of having to defend the validity of our relationship and our labor to our work before we can even start to talk about like what needs to change, right? Because people delegitimize that our work is real work and our work is real work.
Let's change the narrative. Each one of us, when anyone talks to us, we say we're app-based workers, not gig workers, not to be dismissed, not to be, oh, you can get another job. App-based workers, because we have serious issues and it's just a matter of time before it's their issues. But we have to, they gave us the gig, that we're gig economy workers. We have to take it more seriously, and we have to teach other people how to treat us. As a gig worker, we're not taken seriously. As an app-based worker, has more weight.
They would miss us if we weren't here.
Alana, I saw you nodding vigorously, specifically when Vanessa talked about whether or not this is real work, and I wondered if you had more to add to that.
Absolutely. In our line of work, that is the number one thing that we're told. It's not a real job. People don't take it seriously. And in our circumstance of being treated in that, it leads us to being victims. It allows us to be abused by not just, maybe people that employ us, but people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. A lot of people create this notion in their mind that because we do in my industry what we do for a living, besides it's not just, the fact that it's not real work, it's that, they make assumptions about who we are as people. And, as I had mentioned, as you had mentioned, to bring this back together about us being parents, it's really something that links so many of us together, is why we're here and the reasons why we take this work. And, absolutely, we're not treated as if anyone takes us seriously in so many facets, but because we're speaking out, because we're organizing, because we're growing and we're vocal about the issues that we deal with, we're seeing more people on a regular basis really start to understand the effort that goes into our jobs and into our careers. And it's so frustrating too, because no matter, what angle you take, and I would think that maybe people in Jean's line of work would also deal with the same thing of, once you're working in the adult industry and you're, working on an app or working on a platform, they ask you when you try to leave this work, what have you been doing this whole time? As if there's no value to it. And I can only imagine from what we deal with, trying to go into different lines of work or educate ourselves or, move into something that other people think is morally correct. That whole question of what have you been doing this whole time? I could totally see how if a musician was trying to move out of the, performing side of work and you're done and you want to, move on to another job, you get that same question of, well, what have you been doing this whole time? Well, I don't take that seriously. And even though we're all so different, we all have so many similarities based on how other people perceive what it is that we do for a living. So it's that whole side of it, especially for me, it was something that totally opened up my mind to the relationships of no matter what industry you're working in, there's still somebody trying to stick it to you, you know? So it's really interesting.
Yeah, Jean, Alana mentioned the alignment with musicians, and I'm just wondering if you have anything to add to that, specifically about all the skills that you have to bring to being able to perform your work that kind of don't get recognized.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, I mean, I'm still kind of sitting on what Kim had said earlier, just about people expecting you to work for free during the pandemic, which wiped out live performance. So everybody who's dependent on live performance income, it includes the venues. I mean, it includes, but especially the performers who don't have any kind of supportive infrastructure. That work just disappeared overnight. And that's a catastrophic thing for, for people unless they have access to a lot of extra cash. And in that context, I would encounter people being like, oh, I saw this YouTube video of all of these musicians doing, like a coordinated Zoom performance. And it really brought me hope and joy. And that's really great. And I was so glad that they did that. And it takes me to a study that was done by the Urban Institute, where it's like 97% of Americans think that art is important, right? It's important to American life. It's important to identity. It's important to understanding stories. But it was like something like 27% of people feel like artists are important. And just thinking about the people behind the work, you're having this experience, but the person behind the work is a person. They have needs, they have skills, they've learned how to do what they do really well. And this last year, they were really threatened. And it was shocking, not shocking, how little empathy there was extended to that situation, while also celebrating the work.
If I could just respond real quick, that just totally took my mind back to the beginning of the pandemic when so many writers and freelancers were freaking out because all of these publications and media companies didn't understand, like didn't know what to expect. So they slashed budgets and they cut their operating costs and they cut a lot of people loose. And like, sure, to some person in an executive suite, maybe that makes sense, but that sent shockwaves throughout the industry because we don't have any control over our work or our opportunities to work, really. And when a bunch of companies are like, oh, actually, we don't have money for that, like that has a real material impact. And the work we do does matter. Like it's not, maybe not necessarily as physical as some of the other jobs that are here, but there's mental and psychological and emotional trauma and stress that comes with reporting on really anything, especially this past year. Like I'm a labor reporter, so I was just constantly talking to people who are working through this pandemic trying to survive, and like people that were covering public health, people that were covering like more on the ground issues, like that took a toll. And then just seeing just this collective panic over like, oh no, there's too many of us and not enough places are going to give us money to do the work we do. Like, what do we do? Like things kind of evened out a few months in, but I just remember that panic of being like, oh, no one really cares that much about, they want to read our work because they're home and they have nothing to do, but they don't care if we make it. They don't care if we're being paid. Like they still don't, but they really didn't care earlier on.
Kim, I was thinking of you so much when Jean was talking, so I was glad that you said that, and about like what we value in like a functioning democracy, like both things like music and art, and also the people who tell the stories about what is happening in the world. And I know like so much of what has been possible in the labor movement has been possible because of the incredible reporting that's been done and the ability to make what is hard to see visible. And I just, before we get to the Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about what's hard to see, because what I heard from so many of you was that your working conditions are quite hard to see because they are embedded in various forms of software and apps, and the rules are invisible and the connections are invisible. And I just like, before we move on to the Q&A, I just wanted to get like more from one of you about what it's like to work when you can't actually see the rules that are governing your work, and what it means, what cost you bear in order to figure out what those rules are and how you're going to survive.
I just spoke, so I'll be super brief, but and I just want to just mention for a moment the fact that we don't have control over our work. Welcome to capitalism, right? But for my job, so much of my day is spent waiting for someone to email me back. It sounds like it's not a very big deal, right? But imagine like all my bills are due, my rent is due, this piece that I filed 2 months ago hasn't been published yet, so I can't get paid for it. No one's emailing me back about it. No one's emailing me back about news story ideas. Like the clock is ticking, and I'm just sitting there like, I hope this works. And that happens for so many freelancers, like every week, every month, every day. And that's not the kind of thing that you see when you're seeing like people just, chit-chatting on Twitter or seeing someone being excited about a byline. It's just like that constant horror of like, are they going to email me back? Are they going to pay me? Is it going to be enough? Is it going to be on time? Like there's so much, the financial instability and the kind of just that stress of like, and it's such a small thing of like, I'm waiting for an email. It shouldn't be that big of a deal, but I'm sure other folks can relate to that feeling of just waiting for someone to be like, oh yeah, that's cool, or oh no, never mind. Just that constant uncertainty.
I'd love to jump in here real quick. So much of what we do and our ability to get out there and have people hear and understand what is happening in our line of work is so dependent on people like you, Kim, because you guys and those that are especially adult friendly give us the opportunity to take our struggles and put them in front of the public. Otherwise, people don't know. And every time, maybe a different organization would write a story and people would come to the paywall. And so many people just get so frustrated. Why is the story behind a paywall? And I'm just like, are you serious right now? You're angry when your Schmorno is stolen and put other places, or maybe if you're a mainstream actor and your films are put somewhere else, there's that frustration. So why don't the journalists deserve to be paid? Why don't the outlets deserve to be paid when you're the Daily Beast or Vice? And I think the same way I personally watch as people devalue your work, especially when it affects us and we get so frustrated by it. And for our income through the pandemic, obviously all of our on-set workers, it stopped because we had to figure out how to get testing, and testing is such a big part of what we do when it comes to STIs and things like that COVID was a whole new beast, and our people had to figure out how to make that work. So people that were traditionally used to maybe working in a strip club or going to set to perform had to learn how to be an app-based worker, completely fresh, new, no idea what they're doing, no idea how to make the equipment work or OBS and things like that. And then our money became so dependent on those stimulus checks because we are a luxury. I'm not considered a necessity. Those OF memberships are not necessary, and so for us, we were just so dependent on other people getting money and other people getting paid in order for us to, continue to survive. Of course, just like Vanessa with Instacart, the webcam industry on our side saw a huge boom and it was amazing, but not when the stimulus checks ended. And so that was definitely really frustrating for us in all facets of it. So.
That is so interesting. I would love to know if anyone else wants to jump in on how money is actually working in your industry. How, we heard a lot in your comments about like the algorithm determining pay, the question of where tips go. I don't think people really understand how much is taken off the top by any of these platforms that are distributing your labor or your creations and that have essentially a monopoly on the industry, that whatever industry you're working in, which makes it very difficult to, just as people say, up and quit because you don't like it.
Yeah, I mean, money in like the app-based gig economy is just like, it's not working. Like we aren't getting enough. I think that I think Esterphanie spoke to this earlier, but the idea that like, you start off in this sort of like honeymoon period with your app, right? And you're paid well, or relatively well, well enough to not start thinking about the actual cost of doing this work. And I think that most people that do app-based work are people that have come from the traditional economy, and they're used to getting a paycheck, and what they see is what they get, and that's sort of like what there is, right? So people don't realize until it's tax time that, oh shit, like I was supposed to be saving money to pay payroll taxes because I'm quote self-employed, or I'm supposed to carry commercial driver's insurance, right? And like they get into an accident, total their car, and their insurance company tells them, sorry, we don't pay for it because you were working when that happened. You had to have a different kind of coverage. So I mean, we have all of these. I feel like it's like even on beyond like precarity, like we're always like one disaster away from like full on financial collapse. And that's such a stressful way to live. If nobody here has lived that way, then I'm very glad for you. But I think most of us can unfortunately relate to that like roller coaster of emotions. Like Kim was talking about, like, am I going to get this pay today that I was supposed to get today? And is it going to work out so that I don't have to pay an extra $25 on top of this bill because it's late now? Being poor is unfortunately really expensive. So it's a precarious situation, made worse by the fact that, any day we can get a flat tire. We don't know where that money is going to come from, right? And built into really the structure of this work are all of these provisions that make us more reliant upon the work that we're doing. So it used to be when I started, we would get paid once a week. And now every single app has transitioned into some sort of instant cash out system, wherein your employer is now getting a cut of your pay so that you can access it when you need it, instead of accessing it when they want you to have it. And they're promoting the hell out of these things, right? They're like instant pay, instant cash out, instant pay, instant cash out. And they're charging us fees to access money that is like rightfully ours, and keeping us in such a precarious position that we sometimes have no option but to like cash out so that we can buy gas to go on to our next job, so that we can get money to pay our next bill, right? And I think that I think like the most important aspect of this is that it's all by design, it's intentional. And the only way that we have, the only optimism I have of escaping that precarity and that uncertainty and that structure is organizing and like building the alternative to it, which is like really strong worker power, and networks of workers like this who will have each other's backs when the time comes for such and such a person to walk out. You know that you're going to have the support of all of these other people that may not work for your employer. They may not even work in your industry, but they're people that are like, I'm going to throw down for labor because that's what we do, right?
I want to add something just about thinking about these companies that were built, mostly in Silicon Valley by people who didn't really understand the people who are working in those systems, and we're learning by trial and error about how to attract people to use those systems. And there was a good quote from this week that was just about Spotify, which has been in the news more and more. I think people now have a sense of how the streaming economy works, and that people whose music gets used on Spotify get paid fractions of cents per stream. A lot of that stuff is also shrouded in mystery because those rates are all kind of under NDAs. It's really complicated and it's very difficult to know what the truth is, also because copyright is quite complex. But if you look at this quote from one of the founders of Spotify, they're like, well, the problem is Spotify was created to solve a problem. The problem was this: piracy and music distribution. The problem was to get artists' music out there. The problem was not to pay people money. And then the interviewer is like, well, now it's a problem. It's a problem now. You know, there's a lot of protests against Spotify. You know, you should be paying a cent to stream, et cetera. A lot of musicians, especially during the pandemic, have become more vocal about what they're doing. But then he doubles down and he's like, the problem was to distribute music, not to give you money, okay? The problem is to distribute music. And so just focusing on one area of the business and completely kind of ignoring the impacts on the people whose labor is essential to your business being able to function, I think is so typical of what you're going to see coming out of Silicon Valley.
That was a really excellent summation of what Silicon Valley is like. And I feel very snarky about that guy's answer, but that's not my time. But what is related to this, about this goal, as he puts it, to just distribute the music, are the consumers on the other end. And one of the questions in the chat is one about consumer behavior and how consumers become involved. And so I was just wondering if anyone had any stories about ways in which people who consume the labor that you're providing, or people that have been on the receiving end of your services, have been involved in advocating for the people who are working on the platforms.
I'll jump in. The number one thing that we tell people, because for us, a lot of the things that affect our job are legislation. So when we have things happening in specific areas or specific states, because we're seeing a mass movement trying to outlaw so many different parts of our personal business, we always ask people to pay attention to what's happening into their town and vote, to be vocal, to not be afraid if something doesn't look right to them or doesn't sound right and it doesn't align with, you know, their concerns about freedom of speech, you know, especially with our business specifically. That's the number one thing that we ask people to do, to stay vocal with their legislators, because, you know, we're the people who vote and put them into place. So for us, we're like, look at your freedoms and the things that you're affected by that, and understand that it affects us tenfold. And without their support, when it comes to legislation, we flounder, you know, and to educate themselves before they make a decision on how they're going to vote one way or another, because we don't always know what these changes are actually going to create and how they're going to be implemented a lot of the times until it's too late. So for us, that's a big part of it, is staying involved in legislation and vote.
Thank you. That was great. Yes, please.
I think in Prop 22, we saw the public, the people that we service, manipulated, because they had 200 million to get their message across. And I think all of labor, we had 15 million only. So with 15 million, what they were able to do is confuse the voter. Have the voter think, you know, they're able to pay some drivers to do commercials. And they were able to send them mailing. They got mail to vote on Prop 22, yes on Prop 22, to the mail, through email, through the internet. When they turned on TV, they were assaulted. And they couldn't hear, our message was drowned. So unfortunately, if whoever is paying for the ads controls the message. And if you're flooding them with advertising, that's what they hear. So it's not that people would like to care that, I mean, the drivers they talk to, because they're not, other than ordering an Uber, they don't have interaction with the app. They have an interaction with the driver. And unfortunately, they didn't realize that the driver that they use is saying, well, I'm an independent contractor. I want to be my own boss. You know, as if he has anything in common with the CEO. You know, and anyway, it's the public can easily be manipulated unless you have money on your side so that you can speak up, so that they can hear you. Otherwise, you get drowned.
I would just add a very quick thing about how to support artists, musicians in particular is what I know. But I think that you can assume that if there ever is kind of like a Silicon Valley company mediating your experience with somebody who's a worker, that they're probably being exploited. So like paying attention to things like, okay, well, should you be using Spotify? Should you be using YouTube? Or should you be using Facebook? Now, you know, I think that those can be complicated questions for people, and I get that. But a general rule of thumb for musicians, at least, is that if you want to support them, you buy their music and you buy it from them, right? You don't buy it through a distributor. You don't buy it. Like Bandcamp is a great place to go because especially with the Bandcamp Fridays where you know that the money is going to the artist. So that's an example. But I would also say, like, if you're getting delivery from one of those delivery services and they make it possible for you to do a tip, like this is what I do. And I'd actually like to hear if this is the right thing to do. But like, I don't tip through the app. I give the cash to the person who comes to the door because I don't know how much of the tip they're going to get. And so just in general, bringing that skepticism to any of those platforms and thinking about, okay, well, if I assume that they're exploiting the worker, how should I behave? Is also just a way to kind of go through and perhaps think about things differently.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Jean. I wanted to just like hop in here with like a couple of quick, short, practical pieces of advice. One is that, you know, like if workers call for a consumer boycott, like honor that. If there's a picket line, don't cross it, right? Like the same as we would treat all other labor. And really like the last piece being that because our pay is so opaque, because really like culturally discussions about tips are considered very taboo and they're considered very like uncomfortable. As a conscientious consumer, like have those conversations with people and be like, hey, I tipped you this much, make sure that they get the tip. The best practice is to tip in cash and not tip through the app, because we have had so many, I mean, virtually every single company in the gig economy has been caught misappropriating, withholding, or outright stealing workers' tips. And unfortunately, those are such a large percentage of our income at this point because base pay and what our employers contribute to our pay is so low. One of the ways I like to think about tipping is just that even though I think it is a fundamentally flawed practice and there are a lot of like intersecting kinds of bias that happen in tipping that are problematic, the way that I like to think of it is that as a consumer, I now have the power to raise this person's earnings by whatever I'm leaving them, right? So like if I'm like, I really want this person to be recognized for the fact that they work really hard and I see that. And you know, I might leave a 30-50% tip, like depending on what the situation is. And just I understand as a consumer that these companies are really like pillaging and plundering your bank accounts also because the markup for our services are so high. But whenever possible, tip in cash and outside of the context of the app. And just remember that those delivery fees, the service fees, none of that goes to the person that's actually doing the labor of like shopping and delivering your groceries, or picking up your pizza and bringing it to your home, or giving you a ride in their car. So unfortunately, we don't get a share of that. And I think there's a lot of confusion about that among consumers, because they're called things like delivery fees or service fees. It would make logical sense, those things were passed along to us. But unfortunately they're not. So just keep in mind, you know, if you don't rely on these services, please don't become dependent on them. If you do rely on them, which we understand is unavoidable for some people, especially more vulnerable people, if you do have to rely on them, please just make sure that the worker that you're dealing with on a case-by-case basis is being compensated out of your own pocket. And unfortunately, that's the only way you can ensure that they're making any decent earnings.
And I don't know if you know, when you go to the grocery store and they say, oh, you can give money. Do you want to give money to so-and-so, to what organization, or round it up, round it down? You know that that money doesn't always go to help the person. A lot of it supports the organization, you know? And the other thing is also know that when you get a service, when you get a charge from Uber or Lyft or DoorDash or any of them, it's not the percentage. Many times the percent, you can be paying 50%, and sometimes 80% of that is going to the company, not to your driver. So even when you think that, oh, I'm getting, you know, it's like this bill, I mean, it's like $100. There's a surge. It doesn't mean that the surge was passed on to the driver, because according to them, the customer that's you are theirs. So they make an arrangement with you based on the price. They have another arrangement with us based on the price. So they're not obligated to give us any of it as long as we make the minimum that they said that we would in our service contract. So we're only promised the minimum. Everything else, they can decide, maybe I'll give you $2, maybe I'll give you $1, maybe $5, depending on how I feel. So the surge, no matter what you're paying, it doesn't mean that the service, the person who's providing you that service is getting even 50% of that.
Can I just note also that we're kind of explaining the ins and outs of how these work and how to kind of work within them with your eyes wide open. And then earlier, we were also talking about kind of like legislation and kind of improving conditions. I want to emphasize that it isn't an either or, right? So as a consumer, it's like, I think you pay attention to both of those things. We need to take care of the people in the situations that they are now, and then also support them when they're fighting for better conditions and better laws.
Speaking of which, the PRO Act. We're all about the PRO Act. It gives us a right to organize and a right to collective bargain a contract, which for those of you in California, we do not have that right under Prop 22.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like, well, one, I was gonna say, I think Jean's rule of thumb should like go on a t-shirt, and then we could use the sales to fund our narrative work. yeah, it's a hell of a scam that the VCs and the Silicon Valley companies have set up for themselves over the past decade, and very successfully made us believe that they were giving us something we wanted and had asked for. One of the other questions on this topic that I thought would be interesting for folks to hear about is the concept of ratings and the use of ratings to exercise soft control over people. And I was just wondering, like, how do ratings factor into your work? And what would you like to see as a kind of alternative?
The ratings help them police our work. If someone just doesn't like you, they give you poor rating. If they don't like the price that they were given, it's a surge price. They don't like it, they think it's too expensive, they give you a poor rating. So you are often rated on things that you cannot control. So it's not a true measure of how well you're doing your job. Basically, if somebody is feeling you or not.
Yeah. I think it's also really like open to bias, right? Like whether or not somebody has a known bias, like people may tip women less, they may tip people of color less, they may rate them lower for the same performance, for the same sort of, Esterphanie elaborated already on all of these factors that are out of our control, that we get rated on, right? Like in the Instacart world, like if an item is out of stock, or if I had to replace your conventional bananas with organic ones, like I could basically be like downvoted, aka like, receive a poor rating for factors that are completely and totally beyond the scope of anything in my control. And I think one of the things that I would really like consumers to understand is that our jobs are contingent upon maintaining certain ratings. And unfortunately, like reaching a threshold that is not very not very low. It's like, like a 4.8 or something like that. Even in Instacart's world, you could get to like a 4.9 and stop receiving orders. And that's if you're lucky. Like if you're not lucky, you get deactivated, and there's really no recourse because we're bossed by AI and we don't have somebody we can directly appeal to. And there's really no regulations or laws governing, like if we're deactivated from a service, like how do we know that that wasn't a result of something that is, like a protected thing? And so unfortunately, it's a situation I think that's ripe for the amplification of existing bias from our consumers. And unfortunately, the reality is like this is a line of work where most people that work in it are marginalized, right? Like they're already people that are disenfranchised by a traditional economy, people that are Black and brown, people that are immigrants. And there are a lot of really like racist, xenophobic people out there, right? Who like simply don't like where someone's from, or don't like what they look like, or don't like the fact that their driver was a woman, or, it's like we end up in these situations, or don't like that, I say, no, please get out of my car, you're creeping me out. Like the power that consumers have in that dynamic is somewhat problematic, right? Because they shouldn't be ultimately responsible for whether or not we have the ability to work, unless there's been some sort of like very grave violation of interactions with other people. But the reality is that I think a lot of people think a 4-star rating is good. Like they think like that's a good effort. Maybe they didn't find everything that I wanted, and the reality is that you get a couple of those and you may lose access to being able to provide meals for your family, or like have a car to continue to work, or be able to pay your phone bill to continue to work. And so it's just such a fundamentally flawed system, and really set up to position workers to feel like they always have to be going above and beyond what is expected of them. You know, we provide little bags of candy or cards or like, you know, water bottles or packs of gum or chargers for customers, all in the hopes that like we can keep a high enough rating to keep receiving orders, to be able to keep going, right? And the reality is that companies can revoke access to the platform anytime that they want for really any reason that they want. And there's a lot of like undisclosed metrics that we don't know we have to hit. Like it's not even a situation where there's, you know, an expectation we're failing to meet because there's no established expectation that is ever disclosed to us. So I'll stop there.
And another thing is, just about every driver that I've known who's been driving for a long time, they will eventually be deactivated because someone suggested their driver was drunk. And so they will deactivate you right away. That means you're not making any money. And it could be a weekend, you could have your bills due. And you will not work for 48 hours while the app is investigating you, which means it's the app in San Francisco is investigating you in San Diego. And they will be told that that their driver is drunk. They will cut down the app and they won't report it. So that means there's no police officer checking to see if you are in fact drunk, if you've been drinking. Even I've been deactivated twice for drinking or doing drugs while driving, and I've been sober 27 years. So, and I took myself to the police station and asked for a blood test. They said they have no reports from Uber or Lyft.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this has been such an incredible conversation. I feel so lucky to have learned from all of you. And we're going to do a little lightning round where I would love for everyone to share one place of possibility you see in the organizing, some brief story of good news or solidarity that you'd like to share with everyone so we can go out on a hopeful note. And before I kick that off, I want to remind everyone that the second event is empowering gig workers, worker-led, worker-run guerrilla tactics. And we'll be having that at 5 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, July 15th. So please come back here in a week and join us for a raucous discussion of organizing tactics. And now I'm going to ask Kim to kick us off and pass it on to the next person.
Well, I was thinking about this as I looked at the question. I know I should say something like properly inspiring good, but I'll say about something that I just really like that I've been seeing because freelance journalists, I spend a lot of time online, spend a lot of time on Twitter, and I've seen over the past few years this huge shift in how pro-union and pro-labor and pro-worker, just the general vibe is, and just labor people, lefty people, just people on the app, and just seeing what happens when a report comes out or a link is shared around of a company who's union busting or treating workers poorly or refusing to recognize their union voluntarily, just seeing how incredibly hard they are cyberbullied about it, that makes me so happy. It's not the kindest thing to bring into a closing, right? But I think it does signal a broader shift in the public consciousness towards workers' rights, towards labor, towards the power of organizing, and towards the necessity of organizing. And I mean, maybe cyberbullying Jeff Bezos isn't going to get us that much closer to liberation, but it makes it a lot more fun.
Fun is very important, and I also get a kick out of that. I'm going to pass it on to Alana.
Thank you. You know, we're happy because we're getting some movement in some of the spaces. We deal with a lot of inherent banking issues and banking discrimination because of, you know, the vicarious work that we do. And we're excited that as of late, we've been having meetings with, you know, senior vice presidents of MasterCard and heads of Instagram, which is something no one would expect some chick from the adult industry to be able to get in front of these people to talk about how it's affecting our workers. So we're excited because organizing and unionizing really has pushed us forward and brought us to the table to be able to have these conversations that are so important for our workers. So we're excited, and go union to everybody here. I'll pass it over to Jean.
Thank you. I've learned so much, and I really appreciate being in community with you all. I just wanted to say that. I have to say that in the US, like there is a musicians union, and that because and it's a union whose membership has declined, you know, significantly because of a lot of different changes in laws and how musicians work in the United States over the years, to the point that, you know, before the pandemic, I was working within the union to try and figure out how to get it to work on behalf of, you know, those people who aren't playing, you know, in the pit in Broadway, people who aren't symphony musicians, people who aren't studio or television musicians, and that all of that work has really changed over the last year because of the pandemic. And it's a disruptive moment, it's a scary moment, it's a devastating moment, but it's also an exciting moment. The amount of energy that we have that's coming into advocacy in general for music and for the artists, there's a lot of new blood. Before the pandemic, it was mostly dominated by corporate voices. Now we're hearing a lot more from independent artists, the independent sector. They've got a different perspective. They care about things like unemployment insurance, which is something that a lot of folks who did arts advocacy before were just like, that's something else. That's not something that we think about. But now I think it's becoming much more clear how much bridging there needs to be between the arts folks, the artist folks, the labor movements, how much shared work that there is. And there's a lot of people with a much broader imagination about what this future can look like that have become really engaged. And so that does feel like an exciting moment. I'll pass it to Vanessa.
Yeah, okay. I have like two that I'm thinking of right now. One was when established labor tried to get super sneaky and sneak in a Prop 22 style legislation in New York, and Los Deliveristas were the ones that like shut that shit down, right? Like, which was so inspiring and incredible to see, like a group of like organized app-based workers asserting their power and using their leverage in that situation to really like nip it in the bud. And they were like incredibly successful in doing that. And I wanted to just like honor and recognize that moment here. Another, and I'm sure Esterphanie can talk about this a little bit more. I'm gonna plug a strike right quick. So RDU and Gig Workers Collective, and hopefully in collaboration with a lot of other folks in similar organizing spaces, are going to be walking off of our jobs on the 21st of July in solidarity with one another against Prop 22 and in support of the PRO Act. So that's another a shiny moment of optimism for me as well. And I'll pass it along to Esterphanie.
Yeah. I was going to mention Prop 22 that we're going on strike. We're having a strike on July 21st. And we're very excited about that. And we have groups all over the United States who will be joining us. And I think even some groups on the international stage. So it gives us hope. You know, it gives us hope. And, you know, we just wanted to say that just in case you're wondering, will this work? Will all of you, like, we're trying to do this, we're hoping that something will happen. I was one of the members who went up to Sacramento that was invited up to meet the governor's board. And this was about almost 2 years ago. And we were the first group of app-based workers that did not come with Uber or with Lyft to the governor's house. And people were so excited. I mean, we were pulled left and right. Assembly people, senators, all wanted to speak to us. And with that, we got AB 5 passed. So we had no power, we had voice, and we worked. So this really works. Despite everything, this really works. We just have to be loud, consistent, and if it makes sense to you, chances are it's going to make sense to somebody else.
Thank you, everyone. This was such a joy. I learned so much. We're 4 minutes over because we can't be contained to 90 minutes. We're too powerful. So again, join us next week. We will be doing our second event, Empowering Gig Workers, Worker-Led, Worker-Run, Guerrilla Tactics. It's happening at 5 p.m. Eastern, July 15th, and there is a link to RSVP in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. See you later.
Okay.